He called me Foundling at every opportunity, laughed that I wasn't from a real family. But one day I saw his DNA test in the trash and everything changed. Growing up in our house felt like walking on eggshells every single day. From the moment I could understand words, my older brother made sure I knew exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. I was 8 when I first learned what adoption meant, and he was 10 when he decided that knowledge would become his favorite weapon against me. The morning routine was always the same. Mom would make breakfast, setting out 3 plates on the kitchen table. Dad would read his newspaper, occasionally glancing up to ask about homework or weekend plans. But the moment our parents stepped out of earshot, the atmosphere would shift completely. My brother would lean across the table, fork halfway to his mouth, and whisper just loud enough for me to hear but quiet enough that our parents couldn't catch it from the next room. "You don't really belong here, you know that, right?" he'd say, as never leaving his scrambled eggs. Sometimes he'd get creative with it. "Wonder what your real parents were like. Probably didn't want you for a good reason." The words would hit me square in the chest, but I learned early on that reacting only made things worse. If I showed any emotion, if my face crumpled or my voice cracked when I tried to defend myself, he'd double down immediately. Our parents never seemed to notice the dynamic between us. When they were around, he transformed into the perfect older brother. He'd ruffle my hair affectionately, include me in conversations, even defend me if anyone else tried to tease me about anything. It was like watching someone flip a switch. The moment they turned their backs, the mask would slide right back off. School wasn't much better. He was 2 grades ahead of me, which meant he had already established his reputation and social circle by the time I arrived. The few times our paths crossed in the hallways, he'd make sure his friends knew exactly what I was. "This is my adopted brother," he'd say, emphasizing the word adopted like it was some kind of medical condition. His friends would nod politely, but I could see the shift in their expressions. The way they'd look at me after that, like I was something different, something less than what they expected. The worst part wasn't even the direct comments. It was the constant reminder that I didn't really fit. Family photos felt awkward because I knew he was thinking about how I didn't share the same nose as Dad or the same eye color as Mom. Holiday gatherings became exercises in anxiety because I'd catch him watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to make some cutting observation about how I didn't quite match the rest of the family tree. When I turned 16, I got my first job at a local grocery store. Bagging groceries and collecting shopping carts wasn't glamorous, but it gave me a reason to stay out of the house more often. The extra space helped, but it also meant that when I did come home, the tension felt even more concentrated. He'd gotten his driver's license first, naturally, and never missed an opportunity to remind me that he wouldn't be giving me rides anywhere. "You can figure out your own transportation, Foundling," he'd say, jingling his keys as he headed out to meet friends. The fact that our parents had bought him the car didn't seem to register as relevant to him. In his mind, everything that came to him was deserved, earned by virtue of being the real son. Everything that came to me was charity, undeserved kindness that could be revoked at any moment. College applications were another battlefield entirely. He'd gotten into a decent state school with partial academic scholarships, and our parents were incredibly proud. When my acceptance letters started arriving, he made sure to examine each one with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for legal documents. "Looking for the diversity checkbox they probably checked for you," he'd mutter, tossing the letters back onto the kitchen counter. Even when I got into schools with better programs than his, he found ways to diminish the achievement. Update 1. The summer before I started college, something shifted in our house dynamic. Maybe it was because he'd be leaving for his junior year soon, or maybe the constant tension had finally started wearing on our parents, but they began making more pointed comments about family unity and treating each other with respect. Nothing direct, nothing that called him out specifically, but pointed enough that even he seemed to notice. That August, he came home from a friend's house talking excitedly about some ancestry website that had been advertised on social media. Apparently, several of his college friends had done DNA tests over the summer break, discovering distant relatives and ethnic backgrounds they never knew about. The whole thing had become something of a trend in their social circle, with everyone comparing results and joking about unexpected family connections. He'd ordered his kit that same day, practically bouncing with excitement as he explained the process to our parents over dinner. The way he talked about it, you'd think he was about to unlock some great family mystery. He kept making comments about how interesting it would be to see the scientific proof of our family's background, how cool it would be to potentially connect with distant cousins, how the technology was amazing for really understanding where you came from. I remember sitting at that dinner table, pushing food around my plate, thinking about how ironic the whole thing was. Here he was, so excited about proving his genetic connections to our family, while spending years making sure I knew I had none. The thought crossed my mind to order my own kit, just to see what would happen, but honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. What if the results somehow made his treatment of me feel more justified? What if seeing the scientific proof of my lack of connection to our parents made everything worse? The kit arrived within a week, and he treated the whole process like some kind of sacred ritual. He read through all the instructions twice, watched YouTube videos about proper sample collection, and made sure our parents were there to witness him sealing up the return package. The way he talked about it, you'd think he was launching a space mission rather than spitting into a plastic tube. During the waiting period, his excitement was infectious enough that even our parents got caught up in it. Mom started talking about family trees and genealogy research, while Dad mentioned relatives he'd lost touch with over the years. For a few weeks, dinner conversations actually felt normal, focused on shared curiosity rather than underlying tensions. It was almost nice if you could ignore the fact that none of it really included me. 6 weeks later, the email notification arrived. I only knew because he announced it to the entire house, practically shouting from his bedroom that the results were finally ready. Our parents gathered around his laptop screen as he logged into the website, and I hung back in the doorway, not sure if I was welcome to look or not. The first few minutes were exactly what everyone expected. Percentages of different European backgrounds, connections to various regions, the kind of information that confirms what most American families already assume about their heritage. Our parents were delighted, pointing out correlations with family stories they'd heard growing up, making connections between the results and physical features they recognized. But then something strange happened. As he clicked through different sections of the report, his expression started to change. The excitement faded first, replaced by confusion, then something that looked almost like panic. He kept clicking back and forth between different pages, refreshing the browser, checking and double-checking the same information over and over. Our parents noticed the shift in his mood immediately. Mom asked if everything was okay, if there was something unexpected in the results. He just shook his head, closed the laptop, and said he needed to look at everything more carefully before sharing details. The energy in the room deflated instantly, and dinner that night was awkwardly quiet. Over the next few days, his mood got progressively worse. The excited anticipation was completely gone, replaced by something much darker. He stopped talking about the test results entirely, deflecting any questions from our parents with vague comments about the website being confusing or the data being incomplete. But I could see something was seriously bothering him. Update 2. 2 weeks after he got his results, I was taking out the trash when I noticed something unusual in the garbage can outside. Among the usual household waste, there were several pieces of paper that looked like they'd been torn up and hastily thrown away. Something about the formatting caught my eye. It looked official, like documentation from a website or scientific report. Curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully pulled out the pieces. It took some work to arrange them properly, but eventually, I could make out what they were: printed pages from his DNA test results. Most of it was standard information about ethnic background and regional connections, exactly the kind of thing our parents had been excited to see during that first viewing session. But there was one section that made my blood run cold. Under Family Connections, there was a clear breakdown of genetic relationships with uploaded family members. Our mother was listed there, which made sense since she'd uploaded her own sample years earlier for some genealogy project she'd worked on. But next to her name, instead of the expected 50% match you'd see for a biological child, there was a stark, impossible number, 0%. I stared at those papers for what felt like hours, checking and double-checking what I was reading. There was no mistake, no error in the printing. According to the DNA analysis, my brother shared absolutely no genetic material with our mother. 0%. Which meant he wasn't her biological son any more than I was. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Every cruel comment, every reminder of my adoption, every time he'd made me feel like an outsider in my own family, all of it had been projection. He'd spent our entire childhood making me feel like I didn't belong, when he was the one who wasn't genetically connected to our parents. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept racing through years of memories, recontextualizing every interaction we'd ever had. The way he'd always seemed so desperate to prove his place in the family, the way he'd attacked my legitimacy so aggressively, the way he'd clung to being the real son as his primary identity. It all made sense now, in the most twisted way possible. The next morning, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I took the reassembled DNA test results and brought them to our parents. They were having coffee in the kitchen, discussing weekend plans, when I walked in and placed the papers on the table between them. The silence that followed was deafening. Dad's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth, while Mom's face went completely white. They exchanged a look that lasted several seconds, the kind of wordless communication that only comes from decades of marriage and shared secrets. Dad was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you find this?" When I explained about the garbage can, about the torn papers, and the shocking revelation, neither of them seemed surprised by the information itself. They were upset that I'd found out, worried about the implications, but not shocked by the actual facts. That's when the real story finally came out. 24 years earlier, before I was even in the picture, Dad had been involved with someone else. A woman from his college years who'd reconnected with him during a rough patch in his relationship with Mom. The affair had been brief, lasting only a few months, but it had resulted in a pregnancy. When the woman found out she was pregnant, she'd initially planned to handle everything on her own. She didn't want to break up Dad's relationship, didn't want the complications that would come with involving him in raising the child. For the first year of my brother's life, Dad didn't even know he existed. But when the woman's circumstances changed, a job loss, family problems, the stress of single parenthood, she'd reached out. Not for money or ongoing support, but because she needed someone to take care of the baby temporarily. What was supposed to be a few weeks of help turned into months, and then into something permanent when she decided she wasn't ready for motherhood at all. Mom had known about the affair, had known about the pregnancy, and had made the choice to welcome my brother into their family as if he were her own biological child. She'd never treated him differently, never made him feel like he was anything other than her son. In her mind, love and choice mattered more than genetics, and she'd chosen to be his mother completely and unconditionally. The irony was overwhelming. The woman who'd raised him with such love and dedication wasn't his biological mother, while the man who'd contributed half his genetics had been the result of an affair that nearly destroyed the marriage. Meanwhile, I was the one who'd been chosen deliberately, wanted explicitly, brought into the family through careful consideration and legal processes. But there was more to the story. When I was adopted at age 3, our parents had made a conscious decision not to tell my brother about his own origins. They thought it would be easier for both of us if he believed he was the biological child and I was the adopted one. They'd never anticipated that he'd use that information as a weapon, never imagined that their well-intentioned decision would create such a toxic dynamic between us. Final update. The confrontation I'd been dreading happened the next evening. Our parents had spent the day figuring out how to handle the situation, and they'd decided that honesty was the only way forward. They called both of us into the living room and laid out the entire truth, including the parts one hadn't known about Dad's affair and the circumstances that had brought my brother into our family. Watching his face during that conversation was like watching someone's entire worldview crumble in real time. Every assumption he'd built his identity around, every cruel comment he'd made about my legitimacy, every moment of superiority he'd felt, all of it was based on a complete lie. The initial shock gave way to anger, but not the kind I'd expected. Instead of being mad at our parents for lying, or at his biological mother for abandoning him, he seemed most furious with himself. The realization that he'd spent years tormenting me for something that applied more to him than to me was clearly eating him alive. But what happened next surprised everyone, including me. Instead of apologizing, instead of acknowledging the years of pain he'd caused, he started trying to minimize the whole situation. He argued that genetics didn't matter anyway, that Mom had raised him, so she was his real mother regardless of DNA, that the test results didn't change anything fundamental about our family. The hypocrisy was staggering. The same person who'd spent our entire childhood emphasizing the importance of blood relationships and biological connections was now arguing that those things were meaningless. The same person who'd made me feel like an outsider because I wasn't genetically related to our parents was now insisting that genetic relationships didn't define family. I found myself in the strange position of agreeing with his new perspective while being absolutely furious about his previous behavior. Yes, genetics don't define family. Yes, love and choice matter more than blood. Yes, Mom was his real mother regardless of DNA. But if he truly believed those things now, why had he spent years making me feel terrible for being adopted? The conversation lasted for hours, going in circles as he tried to rewrite history and minimize the impact of his behavior. Our parents mostly stayed quiet, letting us work through the implications ourselves, but I could see the guilt and regret on their faces. They were clearly questioning every decision they'd made about how to handle our family dynamics. When it became clear that he wasn't going to acknowledge the pain he'd caused or apologize for his behavior, I made a decision that felt both necessary and final. I went in my room, made copies of his DNA test results, and returned to give him one. "This is what you spent years making me feel ashamed about," I told him. "This is what you used to make me feel like I didn't belong in our own family. Now you know how it feels to question your place, to wonder about your origins, to realize that your assumptions about yourself were completely wrong." The look on his face when I handed him those papers was something I'll never forget. It wasn't just shock or embarrassment. It was the dawning realization that he'd become everything he'd accused me of being, and that his treatment of me had been projection of his own insecurities all along. He left the house that night and didn't come back for 3 days. When he finally returned, it was only to pack his belongings and move back to his college town early. The goodbye was awkward and minimal, with our parents trying to maintain some semblance of family unity while obviously struggling with their own emotions about the situation. That was 8 months ago. We've had no contact since then, despite our parents' occasional attempts to facilitate some kind of reconciliation. They've tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, as something we can work through as a family, but I'm not interested in pretending that years of psychological torture can be erased by a simple apology. The most interesting part of all this has been how it's changed my relationship with our parents. For the first time in my life, they seem to really understand what I experienced growing up. They've apologized repeatedly for not recognizing the dynamic between us, for not protecting me from his behavior, for making decisions that inadvertently made things worse. Mom, especially, has been different. She's gone out of her way to emphasize that I'm her chosen son, that adoption doesn't make me less her child than if I'd been born to her. It's the kind of validation I needed years ago, but it still means something now. As for my brother, I honestly don't know if I'll ever be ready to have a relationship with him again. The DNA results didn't create the problem between us. They just revealed the truth about someone who'd spent years being deliberately cruel to someone he saw as vulnerable. Learning that his cruelty was based on projection doesn't make it hurt less or seem more forgivable. Sometimes I wonder if he's learned anything from this experience, if he's developed any empathy for what I went through, if he's capable of genuine remorse for his behavior. But mostly, I'm focused on moving forward without him in my life. The family I have now, our parents and myself, feels more honest and functional than it ever did when all 4 of us were trying to pretend everything was normal. Maybe that's the real lesson in all of this. Sometimes the healthiest families are the ones where people choose to be there, rather than the ones held together by obligation or genetics. Fair? More than fair.